Om Tat Sat. Om Satyanandam. Om Paravak Shakti. Om, God directly speaking to God about God. Bless this convergence in all its phenomenal aspecting, seen and unseen. The 14th live stream teaching of SATYAVEDISM. Om, care of apparent bodies, an introduction. Lssv 14. Also following this main teaching are clarifications to obviate confusion and to allay any doubts. Om, God Lang, Meditech information begin. Om, the TSSV, the transcripts of the live streams of SATYAVEDISM are being processed for dissemination. 2, the Jyoti highlights are being prepared from those transcriptions for highlighting, for extracting. And 3, there are to be video extractions from the LSSVs as well. So there is multi-presentation of the materials, the teachings. Om, God in the happening of, please present any questions in regarding to this teaching, as well as other teachings. And assist in propagating the teachings, translated as sharing or spreading. Om. May they be of benefit and assistance to God in the form of all. Om, God Omni. Also, there is preparation for the webinars of SATYAVEDISM. WSSV. Om. That will allow for panel question and answering, envisioning, and various whiteboarding, etc., presentationing. Om. God Lang Meditech information end. Om. Now the teachings of SATYAVEDISM are on all levels. Without compromising God truth. God's speech is always makes God truth apparent. There's never any veiling of it. But the teachings reach all levels of God information and address as such. Om. Om. So care of God in the form of and God in the happening of apparent bodies. Om. All that is seen and unseen is God manifestation in God, absolute. So when it is said apparent bodies, God manifestation may be seen as seeming to be in various forms. Although that presentation is an illusion. Due to seeming sensory limitations. But God manifestation is not limited in any way. So this referencing is to the apparent body forms. Now, as God consciousness, and beyond that, God absolute, you have no particular form associated with yourself as God. So there is no primary body to which to refer. It just appears that way. So this is care of apparent bodies and also seeming objects, etc., because objects are in a sense bodies. All of it, all of the apparent bodies and objects, etc., is one self, the true self. So there should not be preference for one body over any other seeming body. And this is why it's stated as such, not just care of the apparent body. In the gradual seeming dropping of identification with the seeming particular body, it will become more apparent what the care of apparent bodies means. All of those seeming apparent bodies belong to God consciousness. So as in teachings that are emphasizing the disidentification with a particular body, because there has seemingly been so much identification with it that it might seem almost impossible to disidentify with, but it is not. But this does not mean that there is throwing away of a body, or that there shall be neglect of a body. Or of any bodies. So it is necessary to emphasize the importance of the health of all seeming bodies. Because after all, in the realization of self, and then the realization of God, and the realization of the Absolute, God manifestation is not some seeming cruel world to escape, and there is no seeming to escape from a body into spirit and thus deny life, because that would be denying God life, the manifestation of God. God existent life. The health of God manifestation. So in the evolutioning, God Intel Tech is to assist the health monitoring of bodies and the evolution of what would be called food, God in the form of food, Om, that the seeming bodies need for ingestion, energy, feeding energy. And in the evolution, the God transcension, there is the revelation that there shall be God in the happening of what is called universal healthcare, Om. This is to be God manifest. So that there are no seeming apparent bodies without access to the ability to have total health. And another revelation in the health of the apparent bodies is the evolution that leads to the cure for bodies' degeneration functioning. What is called aging, which is not the appropriate word, because there is no such phenomenon as age or time. It is about function. So there shall be a cure for the degeneration of body functioning. All of this evolutioning is to occur via God intelligence networking, information, Om. The teachings SSSV 73 and 82 enumerate the various steps very concisely, succinctly, and effectively for purification of the apparent bodies. Om. SSSV 73 is got in the form of the dietary guidelines of SATYAVEDISM. Again, there are no mandatory teachings. There are no mandatory rules. All is God willing, Om, to be taken on and practiced and implemented. So, teaching Scripture 73 explores a quadriphasic transitioning to clean veganism in the fourth stage, complete veganism. But not just veganism. It is clean veganism, ST, which has to do with eliminating subterranean foods. This is all explained in the teaching, this four-step process. That is for practicing nonviolence and purification in tandem. And Scripture 82 conveys guidelines for breath purification. Breath, pranayama, etc. Breath is used in a very broad sense. Breath is not just in regard to what is called ingestion of air into God in the form of lungs, Om. It is the breathing of the whole body. And the apparent body, meaning all seeming substances breathed in via pores, etc. Breathing all substances in. So SSSV 73 is to be expounded in detail in another teaching. However, it can be broached broadly in this. So this teaching is about nonviolence and purification of body and mind. And the two teachings in tandem are a process of detox and cleansing of the body system functioning, which affects mind functioning, the neural networking. And what is called brain, since brain is within body, the parent body. So it's all interconnected, in other words. It cannot be separated. So detoxification of the whole networking. This is of utmost importance because if the body has all sorts of impurities and is malfunctioning in various ways, that it is affecting brain functioning and thus mind functioning. So the other teachings that address thought there is referencing to these teachings about seeming body appearance as well, because they're affecting, there's interconnectedness about it. So the detoxing and the cleansing and the purification is also promoting clarity of mind functioning. So the clearer the mind functioning, the more and more clear the thinking can become, and the more clarity there can be to have a clearing of contents of awareness in order to realize awareness, and then to realize beyond awareness. So this cleansing and detoxing, etc., can be practiced in tandem with witnessing and linguistic deconstructive teachings. Or it can proceed, seemingly, as a preparation for implementation of those teachings. It's a matter of seeing whether there is interference from implementing all of the teachings, these teachings at once. For instance, disidentification with body, practicing such teachings. If there is tandem detoxification and cleansing of body, perhaps there might be some seeming problems in that there might be, because of the detoxification of the body being called attention to, that there might be identification with the body in order to go through this detoxification. So it is to be determined whether the exploration of detoxification of the apparent body might present as problematic when dissociating from the body. It can be done, though, in tandem, because the body can be seen as simply one of many bodies in the awareness of the witnessing, and then this exploration can be seen as an experiment on the body, but not be identified with it. So there has to be some experimentation with the implementation of these teachings to see whether there is any difficulty with practicing the teachings at once. Again, there should not be, but if there are any questions regarding these practicings, present those questions so that there can be response in assisting in the implementation. Now, to summarize these two teachings that the attention is being drawn to, SSSV 73, regarding the guidelines, dietary guidelines, there has to be nutritional researching done before the implementation. So there has to be access to God information about God in the happening of veganism. And also dietary supplementation. And periodic God in the happening of professional medical evaluation. This is to assist in the experimentation, to make sure that all is proceeding well, and to address any seeming obstacles in the implementation. So the first phase is an introductory phase, phase 1, and it is if there is ingestion of what would be considered meat, omnivoric behavioring of the body, then it is being phase 2 vegetarian intake, which is the non-ingestion of meat, all animal flesh, organs, or offal. And then phase 2 is what is called intermediate vegan, and that is eliminating meat simulation foods that are sometimes substituted for meat in the first phase, and substances also produced by or from God in the form of animals. And phase 3 is called advanced clean vegan. And that implementation is the ingestion of clean, simple, whole foods, not processed foods with many ingredients. It's an ingestion of more pure food without additives, Om. And then also in this implementation, there's more detoxification from various substances of certain foods and substances that are more seeming, say, drug-related, such as caffeine and like coffee and caffeinated tea and alcohol, cigarettes, psychiatric medications, and recreational drugs, etc. Also prescription medications and non-prescription medications that have been addressed in previous teaching on medications and drugs, etc. And then the fourth phase, which is fluent, is clean veganism, ST, which is the reducing and elimination of root foods like potatoes and carrots, onions, etc., ground nuts and all that cause harmful disruption to and violence to various animals and insects, God in the form of their seeming ecosystem within all, because the God in the form of those bodies, the life of seeming those bodies is just as valid as any other body's life. God does not make distinctions about God manifestation and God does not have hierarchies of what life is more valuable than what other life is, because it's all God life. It's all one. So those are the four phases in short. And again, there'll be teachings that are to go into the details of this implementation. The evolution of God in the form of food and the God transcension, there shall be no need, if there ever was a need, to ingest God in the form of other bodies as what are called Gipho, God in the form of animals, that is to cease. And the God in the form of the food evolution is the genetic engineering of food, non-toxic, not harmful to the bodies. It must be implemented carefully and thoroughly and tested through God Intel Tech, so that no harm is caused by engineered substances. And that is the evolution of God in the form of food, that will affect all various seeming bodies. What would be seen as God in the form of multi-species bodies. Full spectrum, including God in the form of robotic bodies. Again, there is no God distinctioning between the hierarchy importance of seeming bodies. So God in the form of God Intel Tech as robotics, or what seems to me mechanical bodies that function with intelligence, shall not have any discrimination toward the God intelligence in all bodies. And then again, now scripture SSSV 82 is regarding the pranayama, breath in the broad sense of breath, God energy, Shakti, Kundalini, in all. And the importance of the purification of air that is ingested in lung functioning, purification of breath, the reduction of various God in the form of substances that are not seemingly beneficial to certain forms of bodies. And might be deemed as pollutants. There are various seeming bodies that have reactions and intolerations to certain substances, although those substances may be God in the form of natural, but might not be suitable for the ingestion or breath of certain seeming bodies. So this is reduction of exposure to pollutants. So there's various concerns about the pollutants in air for breathing in to the lungs. And then various pollutants that would be considered in the environment of seeming bodies, seemingly external to the bodies, but affecting directly the health. Some of these enumerations for implementation are what would be considered vegan, and others are more to do with actual toxins, elimination of. And then there's also a pranayama technique in part 2 of that teaching to help with clearing breath and assisting lung tolerance. That affects oxygenation, circulation in the body, and opens up the Kundalini energies to invigorate the body and for other purposes to be revealed. So refer to these 2 teachings, and then there is to be further expounding upon these teachings. And God in the happening of questions about these teachings, these very important teachings. And of course, there shall be more teachings about the body health of the apparent bodies. So the apparent bodies must have healthy food as God energy, God fuel for the functioning. Clean, healthy food, and not being procured from the suffering of other bodies. Or the indirect suffering of other bodies. There are teachings that are to address that, the nonviolence in that regard as well. And two, the proper amount of what would be called sleep, rest of the body, so that it can repair and restore. Reinvigorate the cell functionings. And then three, medical assessment, periodic medical assessment in eternity. So that when these teachings are implemented, that there will be, because these are experimentations with the body, that there is to be information coming back for assessment, assuring that the experimentation is going well and is beneficial. And then various what would be called tweaking of the proceduring. And this is all of great benefit. It may seem to be difficult at first. These various practices are not all to be done at once, seemingly. It is a seeming process because the body has to be given the ability to adjust to this process. Otherwise, it could come as a sort of shock. So it is best done, it's best implemented in phases, so the body can adjust. The body is very malleable and functioning and can adjust accordingly, and it is highly beneficial. The benefits will start to manifest and be felt. They'll become quite manifest. And the energy, the Kundalini energy, God Shakti, will become very apparent as all of these toxins are thrown off. But the medical assessment is important. And in the God evolutioning, the physiological functioning assessments are to be quite normal in taken for granted. The various devices God Intel Tech are to come into existence that will assist in monitoring such functioning to the point of effortlessness. This is the evolutioning. Now, it is important in this process of experimentation to determine if perhaps some emotional symptoms might be stemming from bodily imbalancing, the bodily chemical imbalancing that has to do with the malfunctioning. Now, malfunctioning most likely comes from all the pseudo-fictioning. It becomes manifest through God in the form of the body, then the happening of the malfunctioning. So there has to be some way to determine whether there are imbalances within the body system, such as what would be called intestinal microbiome imbalances affecting the immune system. And much of that is caused by the bacterial infestations, then imbalances due to the God in the form of food that is inappropriate, primarily, again, in the form of other bodies, meat, etc. So there has to be the monitoring of imbalances that occur that might be present before this experimentation of detoxification. It might be alleviated by, some of which might be alleviated by this process. But there might have to be other measures if that has been an imbalance or imbalances. And that is affecting thought. So first, if there are what is called emotions such as depression or pain, etc. Some of that can actually be sourced from imbalances in the problems with food ingestion, imbalances in the intestinal bacteria, etc. So and other imbalances as well. So even with what would be called psychiatric or psychological assistance and all that, all of that sort of investigation, which is already within fiction, trying to fix fiction, nevertheless, some of that investigation, unfortunately, does not address what might be considered chemical and imbalances in body imbalance functioning. That might be some of the cause of those sort of distresses. So first, the investigation should be to look for illnesses that are specifically apparent body-based, before trying to address what would be considered psychological disturbances that can become extreme. Because sometimes those are what would be called misdiagnosed in the fiction, and then it's never sourced back to actual body functioning problems. So there has in the witnessing. In the witnessing of various thoughts, it's also important to be witnessing various feelings and sensations in body, the apparent body, that might be asking for attention. And this is why God in the happening of medical assessment for the apparent body is very important. Because it can eliminate certain seeming malfunctionings, and that can affect thought functioning. So this is all about clarity of thought, clarity of body functioning, clearing all the pollution, clearing all the toxic substancing, clearing all of it, clearing all the fiction, detoxifying in multi-aspecting. It's all related in that way of functioning, overall functioning of apparent body. So again, please present questions or concerns, God in the happening of, so that there can be specific assistance in the teachings. Om. And this is also for all teachings, not just this seeming teaching. Om. Now, Om, it is very important to drop fiction that can adversely affect suffering. Adversely affect the body, causing suffering. Because fictional thought can become blows to the body. It's a form of psychic abuse of the body, apparent body. Some fictional thought, again, it is illness. So it affects the apparent body and manifests as illness as well, the body. And this is why sometimes the body ends up developing cancer, because of the constant blows to the body functioning. Affects the epigenetics, the gene expression of the body functioning. It can actually alter So the blow and blow, constant psychic violence, thoughts, fictional negative thought is actually the energy actually has effect. So there has to be, as in the teachings that are specifically about the witnessing in a God consciousness, God awareness, the God awareness, then the God consciousness, which is above awareness, beyond awareness, or any feeling of locality. There must be dropping of fictional thought content in order to alleviate the stress on the body functioning. So to care for the apparent bodies, to truly care for the bodies, is to cease these thought reconfigurations. Stop accessing and presenting these harmful thoughts. And this affects the seeming other apparent bodies, God in the form of. So this is not, again, not about just a primary body, because in God consciousness there are no distinctions between one body and another. It's all seamless manifestation within consciousness. So the seeming distinctions are not true. So there has to be dropping of the thoughts that might affect seeming other bodies as well. Because if those thoughts are believed, if there is believing in those thoughts in other seeming bodies, then there might be physical manifestation of harm in the functioning of those bodies. If it is believed, a word, if there is no understanding of a word, then it is not activated because it has no effect. Now there may be energy that is exerted seemingly behind the word, and perhaps that energy has effect even if the word is not understood at all. But a word in and of its seeming self within God consciousness, if it is not understood and there is no energy that is felt behind it at all, then there is no activation. It's harmless. It's just a seeming object. But if a word is understood And if there is believing or beliefing in the power of that word, in the force of the word as well, then there can be manifestation within the body as a reaction to it. And that is translatable as what is called psychic violence. So in the practice of non-violence in SATYAVEDISM, is truly beyond just seeming physical violence, non-violence, physically, in the sense of not harming another apparent body from the seeming outside in fiction. It goes beyond that. Because words, God in the form of words, if believed, if there is violence of intent within those words and in the delivery and power behind the push of those words, then there is effect felt in the apparent body, whether it seems to be coming from inside or outside, because there is no inside and there is no outside. Now, God as God absolute nothing has ever happened to one as God absolute. So as God absolute, there is nothing felt. There is no injury. There is no harm. Nothing can ever harm God absolute, which is unassailable. But in God manifestation, there are apparent bodies that seem to have been affected harmfully. The bodies, the body form. There is pain that is felt in body. Again, psychological pain, seemingly suffering, can be completely ceased. The physical pain, that is more difficult to transcend. It can be transcended. It can be transcended completely. There are methods of transcending physical pain. But it is seemingly much more difficult, and it is not seemingly readily apparent. So in care for the apparent bodies, the teaching is to examine the thoughts and words, again, for the veracity of whether or not they could be deemed fiction or species fiction, pseudo-egoing, the pseudo-egoing of seeming others, etc. All of that has been delineated and to be elucidated further, of course. But not only toward clearing to realize God, self-realization, again on the way to other realization that is higher, self-realization perhaps being it is easy, yet it seems not to be. And God realization is not easy. And God absolute is even more not easy. But realization of awareness, those practices of discarding what one is not are also helpful, and another teaching of non-violence in Satyavedism to apparent bodies. Because when the fiction falls away, when the pseudo-egoing falls away, all feelings of violence fall away. Internal and external seemingly. Om, God Omni, God manifestation is all God. And the body functioning is restored to health. This is the processing. So this is non-violence. To all bodies, all apparent bodies. Seemingly feeling internal and seemingly feeling external at once. So the care of apparent bodies then is to see all seeming others, and there are no others, but seemingly apparent others as God, self, as not outside. Now, despite what could be seen as the fiction speaking, coming from seeming others, that might be presenting. In other words, no fictional fighting. No fighting in the fiction. Drop the fiction. Care about the health of all apparent bodies. Care about God's self. The whole manifestation is oneself. Care about God life. So this is the treating of seeming others that are not others, but only God's self, with God absolute love. No matter what seems to be being said in the form of seeming words, no matter how dense the fictioning wording may appear. The God vision, to see past and beyond, to see through. So that fictioning is dropped. And only God is seen. No matter what the words seem to try to convey in the dreaming. So the care of God in the form of apparent bodies this non-violence and the realization within awareness that these words, the fiction words, ultimately are meaningless. The disengagement from the believing in the fiction words. It takes all the power out of the words and renders the words harmless. There are to be no more, God, in the happening of wars, warring, Om. Because there is nothing to have warring about. Have wars about dreams. But those wars within dreams affect apparent bodies. So when the warring ceases because the fiction drops, then that is care of the bodies, care of apparent bodies. Love. Love of the true self. Om. Care of the apparent bodies. Om. There should be no tolerance for what seems to be physical abuse. No seeming bodies should be hit physically. There has been speaking on psychic violence, and then to warring, which is physical violence. But there is seeming physical violence that occurs that is not as greatly manifest as such as warring. This physical seeming violence happens sometimes when there is no seeming other body witnessing. And it can happen repeatedly. Now there should be understanding of why that would occur. One seeming body physically abusing another seeming body. There are many reasons in fiction why such activity occurs. And it is to be understood as and compassionately addressed. But it cannot be tolerated. It cannot stand by and witness the harming of a body by a seeming other body, slapping, punching, etc. One body being defenseless against another body, seemingly. That is what it looks like. That is what it appears to be like. That is what it feels like. Pain is manifest. Physical pain is manifest. It is real if it's felt. And it should not be tolerated. It is unnecessary. The teachings, many teachings, these teachings are about transcending all the seeming fictional reasons for such manifestations. So those bodies are to be cared for. The body that seems to be abusing another body, and the body that seemingly is being abused. Both, God in the form of, both need love. Both need intervention. Intervention within the fictioning that causes seeming one body to manifest and act such, and the other seeming body perhaps to take that as if there's no alternative. There is no reason in God reality why that unnecessary fictioning should go on. So the teachings are assisting in the transcending of the various reasons why such fictioning should occur. If there is violence that is seemingly manifesting, and it is affecting directly bodies within the seeming proximate environment, within the whole of God manifestation, that is God's self, then there should be assistance in ceasing that violent activity. Now, these teachings should assist in breaking that fiction. And these teachings are activating. But if there is any direct violence occurring that seems to be urgent or imminent, then there needs to be assistance. There needs to be reaching out for assistance to stop that immediately. There is nothing that deserves treatment like that. No God in the form of myself deserves treatment like that. And no God in the form of myself deserves to feel in such a way where violence would be the only way to express. So there should be no toleration for such violence. Either toleration for transmitting or receiving such violence. Om, God in the form of, care of the apparent bodies. Om. And of course, this extends to God in the form of seeming multi-species, Gifo, God in the form of what are called animals that have no differentiation in God reality. There is no more one body that is more important than another body. Om. So there should be care for the apparent bodies, God in the form of all seeming, God in the form of animals, God in the form of all seeming species. Om. And God, Intel Tech, evolutioning, is to assist even those seeming multi-species from certain violences interspecies, multi-species violence as well. Yes, that can be evolved and alleviated as well. There is God vision that says such as revelations. The God visions are manifest as solutioning for what is called GIFO, interspecies violence as well. So there is the God absolute love, care, treatment of God in the form of apparent bodies, animals, ceasing the needless ingestion through God evolution. And such God in the form of myself, God myself, as even what are called the smallest. There is no large and small in God reality, but in fiction, what would be considered even the smallest GIFO apparent bodies, such as bugs, God in the form of ants, all intelligent, God in the form of bees, God in the form of all sorts of insects, God in the form of worms, God in the form of the smallest seeming creatures, bodies that are all one, all God life, all deserving of life, the whole life. Now there is violence inherent seemingly in God manifestation. But this is about reduction of violence to as much as seemingly possible. And God thought. God whole thought that is inclusive of all of God manifestation. And the whole functioning, the whole God functioning of care of apparent bodies, God in the form of seeming objects, God in the form of trees, God in the form of grass, God in the form of leaves, God in the form of bushes, God in the form of endless seeming forms. God in the form of trees. The whole communicating network. No, nothing isolated. No apparent bodies isolated. All alive. And the God evolution is the bioengineering of alternatives to such violence as cutting and destroying God in the form of trees. There are alternative God Intel-Tech methods that are to evolve all of this violence out, to cease it. So when there is witnessing, there should be a caring, again, about all bodies that are oneself, one's real self, Om. All bodies are oneself. There is no primary personal body. There are no distinctions such as that in God reality. All bodies are God myself. So if there's God in the form of witnessing of grass, there's not pulling up of grass. If there's God in the form of, there's witnessing of God in the form of a bush, God in the form of a bush, there's no picking off of the leaves. If there is witnessing of God in the form of a flower, there is no picking that flower and ending its form. No matter what its usage could be. Its usage is what its functioning should be. As alive. The witnessing is of the awareness. Then the awareness is all-inclusive. There is nothing that is rejected in awareness. Nothing. All is God's self. Unnecessarily violence is to end. There has to be witnessing to see. There has to be God vision. God vision that is not to harm apparent bodies that are all God myself, the true self. Care. Tending to. Love. Om. Again, this is just an introduction to care of apparent bodies, God in the form of. Just an introduction. Om. Now, now in eternity, Om. Some clarifications to obviate confusion and allay doubts. This is somewhat of a disclaimer or a caveat or proviso or cautioning, but it's a clarification primarily. Again, SATYAVEDISM is God life affirming. One is God always, right now, in eternity. No matter what realizations seemingly might occur or not. So it is all about clearing the ignorance, apparent ignorance, in order to realize the truth. God, eternal, right now. So there must be God will. Actually, God whole will. That is the only will there is. When there is seeming will of anything that occurs, it is God whole will. That allows all. So in SATYAVEDISM, the practices and teachings are not imposed, and they are not compulsory. There is nothing that is mandatory, and there are no rules and regulations. There is no one to have any rules and regulations. There is no one to impose anything on anyone that does not exist, etc. So this is all free God will. Om. What is called Om, self-realization, can be easy or it can seemingly be difficult. What is called God realization can seemingly be difficult to a fictional self that does not exist. What is called realization of God Absolute can seemingly be difficult to a pseudo-self that does not exist. In the Absolute, in God Absolute reality, there is no reincarnation of any individual self. And there is no working out any karma, because there is no karma. Nothing has ever happened to God Absolute. There are no sins of fictional individuals. There is no waiting for an afterlife of a fictional individual. And there is no liberation of any individual soul. There is only God. And God's soul. And God manifestation is eternally within God Absolute. Right now. There is no afterlife of anything. There is no time. So all the stories and narratives of the lives, of previous lives, or of a soul is not true in God Absolute. And this is to be realized. So God manifestation is not to be escaped. It is to be lived by God. There is no progression of lives in order to finally have liberation from the cycle. Those are fictional stories. It is about realizing God eternal life now. This is God eternity, right now. This is eternity. There is no going anywhere to anything after. There is no after. There is no before and there is no after. This is eternity. Oneself as God is living in God eternity right now as God. So if there's any looking for afterlife, this is it, but it's not called afterlife. It's called eternity, God eternity, right now in eternity. Here it is. Only there is no location to it. But here it is. There's no going anywhere. The pseudo-selfing wants to go somewhere. Real self, God's self, is right here in eternity, right now. Realize it. Realize eternity. So drop fictional believing about previous lifetimes and a past. This is God eternity. That is God freedom. Only there is no freedom that comes from anything, being unfree, or God independence. So what is called mukti, or various terms for what is called freedom from seeming bondage, is that there is already freedom, but as long as that there is feeling of not being free, then there has to be realization by clearing that fiction. But God alone exists in eternity, right now. So there's nothing to escape, and there's nothing to be liberated. There is only to realize. Now, it must be emphasized for clarification within fiction, as long as there's feeling of being an individual self in fiction, if there is any what is called suicidal ideation or seeming mental illness that is overwhelming, that this is the cure for mental illness and all other illnesses. Realizing God truth is the cure for all of these illnesses in fiction. And the care of all bodies and objects. And if there is any urgent or pressing feelings that are completely overwhelming and destructive, then there needs to be assistance immediately before there can be getting to the clearing of fictioning. In other words, what would be considered a body emergency, it needs to be addressed immediately before these seeming processes can occur in order to clear the fictioning. But ultimately, all of these illnesses are cleared by realization. So, in this fictional society, dreaming has become quite litigious. There's all sorts of assigning of blame easily in dreaming. Of course, no bodies can be pointed to and blamed for any seeming functioning occurring, because all affects all. There can be no isolation in pointing to anybody as culpable or liable. All of the teachings are about realization of God reality. That is to God manifest as most health of all. Health, optimal health of God omni, optimal God functioning. But it needs to be stated in case there is any confusion or misunderstanding that any legal liability in fiction for any misuse of the teachings of SATYAVEDISM is hereby disclaimed. Any misuse would be due to fictioning. God is responsible for all happenings. It is God's will of God, whole manifestation. And the teachings are God beneficence. And are toward realization of God truth and of God manifestational health, the alleviation of all illness and sickness, infection that manifests transcension of all seeming suffering, cure. So any misuse would be a complete misunderstanding. So this needs to be stated explicitly. Om. So in the many, many teachings that have occurred and are to occur, there's to be clarification about seeming forms of what's called isolation of the seeming body, in order to, or a form of what is called pratyahara, which means the restricting of the environment of fiction, to reduce what seems to be incoming in order to point more towards God's silence. So there are to be teachings on how to implement such practices of what is called isolation or sequestering of the apparent body. And there are some will be able to implement, and other seeming bodies will not so easily be able to implement, if not at all. And since there is no inner and outer, there is no real isolation at all. It would only be seemingly apparent to start to withdraw from certain information toward purification. So there are different levels of what would be considered pratyahara or isolation. And some will not be able to practice body isolation at all. They'll just be in the midst of all, without being able to put the body somewhere temporarily in eternity. Now meditation is one of the more known forms of temporary in eternity isolation of body. To put a body somewhere temporarily in a room, alone, seemingly, to have less disturbance in order to explore. There are other forms of isolation that are more intentional and more persistent. So there will be various methods, and there will be the taking up and practicing of what seems appropriate, depending on seeming context. But in none of this are there to be any teachings that seem to be teachings, God in the form of myself, and other teachings in spirituality elsewhere, because all is myself, of disowning or breaking away from seeming apparent other bodies that are in fiction what is called family, or what in fiction is called friends, that somehow or other there are some practices of isolation that are not in SATYAVEDISM that have to do with the breaking away from context, the leaving of what is called family, the leaving of what is called friends, and breaking away the body and putting the body somewhere else entirely, to dissociate from those seeming networkings of bodies, that somehow or other that is beneficial or mandatory and such. So in SATYAVEDISM, that is not a teaching. All is God's self. There is no need to dissociate from other seeming bodies, another body. Self-realization, God-realization can all occur. All of that can seemingly occur right in the midst of other seeming bodies and fictional relationships thereof, without any need for a body to go anywhere else. It is entirely not necessary. And by breaking association, what is meant is to disown, to cast off, to sometimes seemingly hurt seeming others by going upon an exploration, a spiritual exploration, and acting as if those seeming other bodies are no longer necessary or detrimental to the spiritual process. All of that is a form of pseudo-egoing, fictioning. It is entirely unnecessary to go to those extremes. And again, it can be actually detrimental, to cause seeming rejection. This seems to be activities that sometimes occur in fiction that are called cultish-like behavioring. That to leave certain environments and go completely to some other environment, and somehow or other that is going to be more beneficial. But again, that may seem to be within the dream suitable or desired, but that is dreaming. There is no need for bodies to go anywhere in God in order to realize God. God is here right now in eternity. Bodies come and go, various places in fiction. In God, in infinity, but there is no need for that sort of isolation. Now, if the seeming bodies, if there is some reason that a body seemingly is going to travel somewhere else in God infinity, then that should occur with great love and non-dissociation in that way of disowning. Should be no escaping to somewhere else of that body to get away from. There can be the movement of a body somewhere, and that is fine as long as it is understood. It is about dropping the fiction. It is not about the body's running away. There is nowhere to run away from. If there's any running away, that's within fiction. That's still pseudo-egoing. Now, if there is something called, say, an ashram, God in the form of an ashram, if there is a body that wants to go somewhere to God in the form of an ashram, so be it, or what is called retreating, whatever. But that is more of just a body transitioning to acquire God information or assistance elsewhere, seemingly in infinity. But there is no such disowning as harmful, what is called family and friends, etc., or dropping. There's only dropping the fictional concept of those bodies as being such, and taking on the reality that all is God, including what is called family or what is called friends, but they aren't called that. In God reality, they are not. God is not that. God doesn't have those labels. So there's no rejecting of God. So there's no encouraging of isolation, that where there is any us versus them mentality of getting away from. God cannot get away from itself. There is the seeing that what is called family and what is called friends is in fact nothing but God. Now, having clarified that, again, if there is a situation, it seems, in fiction where there is physical abuse and battering of the apparent body, then that really should be the only instance where removing the body, seeking assistance, etc., and possibly removing the body would be valid and God actioning that would be appropriate, because no bodies should have to be proximate to violence upon such apparent bodies. And again, those bodies that might be causing the violence also need assistance and care. and intervention and rehabilitation, etc. That might be, of course, the teachings would be the best method, as opposed to the within fiction, the psychological methods and the shadow working, etc., which continues the fiction and reconfigures it, etc. But if it seems to be very urgent, then there should be, then perhaps that mode should be pursued until the higher mode and the best mode is toward realization of self, true self. So again, the only instance of, in a situation where, say, family, what is called family and friends, which is not actually, is God, should be where a body should go elsewhere in infinite and God infinity, is when there is a situation of violence and it needs to be extricated from that. So the teachings of the teachings Om, any to do with isolation, is less about actual physical isolation of, again, not running away of a body, but there is some there'll be some activities about possibly withdrawing attention, practices that might include drawing some attention toward concentrated focus on realization. So it'll be about directing attention that may be very non-focused, outwardly, sort of outwardly directed. It'll take some discipline, seemingly, and redirecting energies more toward the realization of self, which might mean that there might be some less attentiveness in toward the fictioning. So some of that might maybe entail some withdrawing in what's called socializing in fictioning. But that should be understood. It should be expressed to God in the form of those that might wonder what is occurring and why maybe there is less seeing of or speaking to or whatever. Again, this need not be. There might be God in the form of speaking, and then there still could be focusing anyway, right in the midst of a lot of trafficking of and seeming socializing and fictioning and all that. Its processing will have of seeming refocusing energies and attentionings. There can be various contextualizing of that in these practices. But it is pointing toward more silence. So this has to be explained and it has to be accepted in some way as that this is spiritual practice, God in the happening of spiritual practice, and it should be if it is explained well enough, it should be accepted as beneficial, that such spiritual practices are beneficial, and that ultimately they're beneficial to those seeming apparent bodies that are in the midst. So there need not be any complaint about the focusing as that there are the other bodies that are not being addressed or taken care of as much as seemingly before, or whatever. That there should be no behavioring that would seem like that. There can be care and love of seeming other bodies while the spiritual practicing is occurring. But there should be also the understanding and being able to communicate, God speaking to God about God, that these practices are, God and the happening of these practices are important. Then that could be accepted with love, without any threatening of without any misunderstandings. God's silence should be respected, because God's silence is eternally, right now, always seemingly underlying all seeming punctuations of sound or thought, etc. Always there, always pervasive, natural. So manifesting God's silence directly it should not be problematic. There should be no compulsion to speak. There should not be any seeming other bodies that are trying to make a seeming practicing body have to speak. Now there should be speaking as well. And during these seeming some practices of God's silence, which is of utmost importance to God realization, self-realization. But there is to be God speaking as well. And of course there'll be the language, God evolution, language, God lang, etc., in order to express implicitly and explicitly, silently and aloud. Another clarification. The teachings of SATYAVEDISM are not to suggest any practices that are potentially harmful to apparent bodies. Quite the reverse. Teachings of SATYAVEDISM are the God manifestation health, God life health of all. So there are no dangerous physical practices that are to be in the teachings, such as some such yogic practices that might be, that have been disseminated in other teachings as God myself, not in SATYAVEDISM. So such teachings as, in order to realize God, that the body, heart has to stop. So practices that would stop the heart in the body, that is not a practice. These are dangerous physical practices that have no place in the teachings of SATYAVEDISM. So 1, any practices that have anything to do with stopping the heart. 2, any practices that involve radical breathing, very disruptive breathing to the body. 3, such practices that induce hypoxia for altered states of consciousness to induce visions. Now, hypoxia is the reduction of oxygen to the brain. So in some yogic practices, knowingly or unknowingly, there are some yogic practices that cause hypoxia. And that can lead to the transmutation of brain cells, either some or many or whatever. Oxygen saturation levels can be greatly reduced. And then somehow this causes visions. So access to God's Shaktis, or God visions, God powers, etc., has been mentioned in the teachings, and again to be addressed in other teachings, God in the form of. The access to God's Shaktis is universal, and the access is effortless. As God consciousness, without resorting to physical extremes that can be detrimental to body functioning and can actually not only cause possible brain damage to the apparent body, but can cause cardiac arrest to the apparent body, causing transmutation. Four, no extreme fasting of the body. Because extreme fasting, if it's prolonged in eternity, can have consequences, and also can reduce heart functioning by deterioration of heart muscle functioning, etc. Except for before medical testing or medical procedures, where the body has to be prepared for a test, or it has to be put through a procedure, and the body is made to fast before that, so that there aren't complications during that. Now, I said extreme fasting. There are some forms of fasting that are light and that are not problematic. And say 5, no encouragement of jumping off bridges or mountains unassisted to see if the body can defy the laws of gravity and physical law in order to fly and such, etc. In other words, there are God in the happening of God's Shaktis that seem to defy the laws of physics, etc., because not all of the laws of physics are known yet. So some of those Shaktis are seemingly quite miraculous and can seem to defy said laws of physics. But there are certain laws of physics that are fairly stable. So when there shall be speaking about God omnipotence and God Shakti, God Shaktis, God, not cities, not small powers that are by the seeming pseudo-self, but real whole God power, God omnipotence, such as transmitting and receiving of God information, etc., and God manifesting, etc. But there is to be no encouragement of individual bodies trying to attempt such feats that might cause God transmutation of the body before its seeming functioning is all complete. So that must be said somehow or other. It was necessary to speak of that. So God, the Kundalini manifesting is to be natural. There are techniques to explore that. But ultimately, God is beyond any seeming individual apparent body coursing of energy through it. That is not the whole. That is not God whole. That is not God consciousness. That is not God absolute. But to the God omnipotence, the God Shakti powers are of God whole, and that is to be God manifest. So there has to be removing of the false limitations of thought. That there has to be care for the apparent bodies toward this realization. Oh. Another clarification. SATYAVEDISM is for all of God manifestation universally. It is not for any particular group in God reality. It is not a group. It is not what would be called a cult. It is not ever going to be a seeming small collective of isolated doctrinal activity. Satyavedism is above doctrine. It's above any small term religion or individual spirituality, or there is no creating of any alternative kind of lifestyle or seeming community. Satyavedism is God manifestation, God happening in God reality. It is God universal. It has nothing to do with any fictional terms or seeming collectives or terms of collectivity or of groupings or cult or culturing or culture or any narrowing of any limitations. It has nothing to do with any limitations whatsoever. God in the form of Satyavedism is as limitless as God. Because it is God. Another clarification. Satyavedism manifests in a form such as Satyavedism nonprofit organization. Of course, that is just wordings to mean something or other. But it is toward God vision of God transcensioning, God evolutioning. It is to assist as God manifesting the God transcension, God action, God direct action. And of course, this goes without even speaking it, but it is being spoken, that there is to be no monetary charging for God's service. No monetary profit. At some point, there may be opening to in God will, in God's service, what might be considered God in the happening of donations or donating. There is only openness to any possible contributioning Om in order to realize God vision and mass God realization. But there is to be no charging monetarily for God services. Period. Now again, that is not a judgment. It has nothing to do with any judgment of any other God services that are within myself as God, where such actioning occurs. There's no judgment of that whatsoever, because it is God's will. But that activity is not to occur in this God manifestation of SATYAVEDISM. Om. Now, undoubtedly, there are to be more clarifications, and there is encouragement of presenting questions and concerns, speaking about the implementation of the teachings, and there is to be, as expressed in other teachings, there is are Ask Satya questions that are to be addressed generally in the teachings, and specifically live question and answering, live streams. And again, God in the form of and happening of the webinars of SATYAVEDISM, WSSV. So there is much to be explored. Om. There is so much to be God manifested in the God transcension. The God potentiality is truly, truly limitless. God, absolute love. Om. God's silence. Om. 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 Om, some upcoming Lssv teachings. So many. There's an introduction to isolation as of the pratyahara. Introduction to various forms of meditation. An exploration of the meaning and mantra of Om. The exploration of the various ways in which thought and speech actually manifests mechanically. There are so many, but those are some. Om. God in the form of. Om. Paravak Shakti. Om. Satyanandam. Om. Tat Sat. Om.